And in 3, 2, 1.
You are now listening to the Lapsed Graps podcast.
Hello and welcome to the first ever 12th episode of the Lapsed Graps podcast, where I, Jam, don't watch wrestling, but I speak to my friend
Sam, who does?
And this is the Lapsed Graps podcast. I don't know why I said that again. I'm not used to being the A mic, so forgive me, but this is a very special episode of Lapsed Graps. This is a retro rewind. I said that with a bunch too many W's there, but this is a retro rewind, and this time we're rewinding for WWE SummerSlam 2005. Before we go ahead and talk about it, what did you think about the show?
The show held up a lot more than I thought it would. So, for context, if people haven't seen our episode of the Mental Health Check-In podcast, obviously your main podcast that you host that kind of spurned on Lap Scraps and everything, SummerSlam 2005 is the first pro wrestling event I ever saw. My buddy's father rather was going through a divorce and was trying to be the cool dad, so he bought us a bunch of wrestling DVDs from a Blockbuster, and that was one of the ones that got bought, and we just watched it on a loop. That whole, parental strife thing aside, it was the thing that sparked my interest in pro wrestling, because it was these larger than life characters doing battle, and I'd always been fascinated by like the Spartans and like the Roman Colosseum and the Olympic Games and things like that, the best in the world going to battle to prove that they are truly the best in the world. And wrestling hit that note on the head for me. And it's so interesting going back and watching the show that at this point is 15 years old and seeing these people that are still such vibrant members of the community and so important to the community, and then others that are just not there at all. So you've got, Rey Mysterio, you've got Dave Batista, you've got John Cena, there's an Edge match there's a Kurt Angle match on there's obviously Eddie Guerrero is on this card because this is the legendary ladder match for Dominik's parentage card that's this card is that ladder match that even if you're not a wrestling fan, you've heard of the ladder match to determine who the father of this kid is. No DNA tests are necessary. It's just a ladder match. It makes no sense, but it does because it's wrestling. And it's wild to me how do I put this? How influential these people are that are still around. So, like, you're starting to get the beginnings of the C Nation era. And this is his first championship reign, and he beats Jericho, the longest reigning AEW world champion in 2020, to maintain his first reign. You've got Dave Batista, who's one of the bigger character actors in Hollywood right now. You've got Kurt Angle, who returned unexpectedly to the WWE shortly, a couple of years ago after leaving, not that long after this SummerSlam match, just destroying, I can't even remember the guy's name, but though just some random jobber guy who stole his gold medal and gets destroyed in 2 minutes. You've obviously got some issues at the start of the card that I'm sure we're going to get into, but it's impressive to me how stacked that era of WWE was and how immensely over everyone on that card was. There were no dull spots during that entire card, which I think is something that wrestling fans today tend to take for granted, because there are, you're gonna get a King Corbin match every pay-per-view right now. That's just how that's gonna happen, because WWE sees something in him that they don't see here. But because of how strong they were in that era, if the fans weren't behind you, you didn't get a place on the card. So the only people wrestling on this card for 3 hours are the most over in the company, and I think that's a really special thing that we were able to go back and witness.
That's a really interesting perspective on it. Like, I wasn't as blown away by the overall card as you were, but I was blown away by the fact that, for one, how much variety there was on the card as far as like personalities and just the way wrestlers look. Like we always talk about how this era of wrestling, ruthless aggression era, was very much a big guy feel. Like for many years, up until maybe just a couple years after this show, WWE was very big guy heavy. If you weren't a big guy, you probably weren't featured prominently on the card, but there were a lot of different unique personalities, unique characters throughout the card, and I think that's really interesting. And more importantly, there were a lot of wrestlers and characters who, like you said, either aren't around or have had a big impact on the industry since SummerSlam, and in many ways have evolved immensely since SummerSlam as characters who look and act completely different from how they acted in 2005. I think that's fascinating and really calls back to just how wrestling can just evolve in the most subtle and fascinating ways, I think.
Absolutely. And it's one of those things where 70, if not 80% of the people that appeared on that card are either currently or will shortly be WWE Hall of Famers. You know, you've got Eddie Guerrero, Rey Mysterio, Chris Jericho, Dave Batista, JBL, Kurt Angle, John Cena. You know, there's also the Chris Benoit in the room. You know, whatever your opinions are on whether he should be in the Wrestling Hall of Fame or not, I don't think he should, but that's my own thing. You know, you've got such incredible people from literally the very first match to the main event. And it's just, I don't think we've ever seen an era of WWE that stacked with talent that respected the talent as much as they did in 2005.
100%. And just to add a little bit more context to it, I was really interested to go into this card just because I had never seen this pay-per-view before. I saw three matches on here before the ladder match, Matt Hardy versus Edge, and Hogan versus Shawn Michaels, but everything else was pretty much completely new territory for me. So I was really curious to see how the card held up, and with or without like that 15-year gap, is it just a good show? And I guess we're going to get into that right now. And since you mentioned it, let's talk about that opening contest between Orlando Jordan and Chris Benoit, who a lot of people feel like whether you're into wrestling or not, you know who Benoit is. Unfortunately, his legacy is that impactful for all the wrong reasons. And it's well, let's get into
I
it.
should have wore my woman shirt for this recording, man. It's the only piece of wrestling merchandise that Nancy Benoit has ever had. And I didn't think about it, but I should have done it. First, I wanna start my opinions on this match with fuck Chris Benoit and everyone who stands with him and defends what he did. CTE notwithstanding, you have no right to take the life of another person, let alone a small child who has done nothing to you. Now that that's out of the way and the stance is perfectly clear, fuck Benoit. This match was not good. Objectively, even if you are a Benoit fan, which I don't know how you could be, this match was not one of his good matches that's thought back on with any kind of uh, rose-colored glasses. This was a 2-minute squash where Orlando, current U.S. champion, comes out, you know, is running around, you know, gets a closed fist like pop shot on Benoit in the corner. Benoit goes full honey badger on him, pulls him into a submission, and he taps out. It was quick, it was stupid, and it probably should have gone on the pre-show, but you know, Benoit, even at that time, was a big name, and they wanted him on that main card.
Yeah, like this is I don't even feel right really calling it a match. It's barely a segment. Like you said, it's like
Mhm.
20, 25 seconds, and I didn't enjoy it, but it's weird because like with stuff like this, I'm not sure how to judge it, especially having Benoit in the match adds a whole nother layer that makes it hard to judge in itself. But it's hard to judge a 20-second match because on one hand, if it's not entertaining, you could say it's bad on that grounds, but it also didn't try to be a match. It was just a springboard to get Benoit over, I guess. And which I'm not even sure if he really had to do because this is like a year removed from his big WrestleMania main event win. He's already over. But I guess it achieved what it was trying to do. It got Benoit over and got a quick match, but to start off the show, it's a really weak start, I think. Like you start off the show with a hot, exciting match. You don't start a show with a 20-second squash match.
Absolutely. And it is one of those things where, hindsight is 2020. So obviously we're biased because Benoit's a piece of shit. And obviously we're biased because we're not actively watching. I think they were on SmackDown because you had Taz commentating this match. So we're not watching 2005 SmackDown week to week to see this. So we don't know if Orlando Jordan, we don't know if he's doing the cowardly heel shtick with the U.S. Championship and dodging Benoit. We don't know if he's been destroying everyone who comes after his title. We don't know if he's doing, a Ted DiBiase or if he's doing a Brock Lesnar on the weekly TV program. So we don't know why the crowd reacted the way they did when Benoit pulled him into that submission and submitted him within 30 seconds. The crowd loved it, so you have to take it for what it was at that point. And obviously it was a well-received match at that moment. It just wasn't what I would have chosen at that time, knowing what we know now, to start that card, but also you can't really look at it with today's prejudices and say, that was a bad decision.
True, and like I didn't consider that. Like that's a good point. Like in week to week TV, particularly in watching in 2005, storyline may have made sense, and like I don't know a whole lot about Orlando Jordan, but I know he was in the cabinet with JBL, and that got him a lot of heat. I don't know if the cabinet is still a thing at this time because the cabinet didn't interfere in the no DQ match we talk about later, and I kept expecting them to, but they did. Orlando Jordan did show up, so either Orlando Jordan has been playing a good heel up until this point, or he's still carrying heat from his cabinet days, but I guess it got the crowd to pop early on, and it got people to boo Orlando Jordan. Again, it achieved what it wanted to do. It's just not entertaining to me in 2020 for a
Absolutely.
multitude of reasons. Yeah. So I
Absolutely.
guess
Oh, I'm so sorry. Go ahead.
I was gonna move on to the next match, but if you got anything else to say.
I was just gonna say it's a definite disparity between this and Bound for Glory 2007, which we did our first retro replay on, where even though those matches were 13 years ago, they were still entertaining matches. They were still good, even without the context of the weekly television storyline. They were at its core good matches, and I think that's where you can kind of see how WWE at that point was differentiating itself from a typical wrestling company, because every Bound for Glory match was 15-20 minutes. There were no squashes. This card alone had two that I can remember off the top of my head, matches that ended within 3 minutes.
Yeah, and that's a really good like when you really look at the polar opposites of how Bound for Glory opened and how SummerSlam opened, it's really making me not like the SummerSlam opener even more. Because again, like I think a good way to start a pay-per-view is a hot, exciting match, and Bound for Glory delivered in an Ultimate X match between three X Division superstars or cruiserweights as they'd be called in WWE, and a big boy in Hernandez, and they tore the roof off in arguably the match of the night. This is not the match of the night on anybody's card,
Nope.
and this I actually think this whole card would be so much better if it wasn't even on it, or at least was moved to the middle of the card at the very least.
Yeah, put this match on instead of having, I think it was Kelly wash Vince McMahon's car in the parking garage. Do that.
Let's talk about that.
Oh, that comes up in a little bit, but yeah, there's a segment where, for one, I do want to talk about, because there is the overarching theme of does it hold up, and the wrestling does. It's a weird point for me in WWE because a lot of the matches, aside from the Benoit squash and well, even the Angle squash that we'll get into, was entertaining because Angle's a good guy and I'm a fan of Angle. But like the fact that Lillian Garcia is wearing a schoolgirl uniform while she's doing ring introductions, the fact that like Kelly is soaping and like slowly washing Vince McMahon's car backstage, just the blatant sexism in the way they're showing their product. The fact that Lita's relationship was on the line in the Edge versus Matt Hardy match, and Lita's out there in like some low rise jeans and like a black bralette. She's not wrestling, she's not in wrestling gear, but she only wears bralettes. Like she doesn't own a shirt. It just the blatant, you know, we're still attitude era pal, I'm gonna make the women dress skimpily and they'll be on your screen just long enough for you to want to pause and go back, but not long enough that you get bored. Bullshit is the main issue that I have with this era of WWE, and one of the main reasons that my mom and her friends wouldn't allow me and my friends to watch this stuff, because at the end of the day we could go blue in the face saying we just want to watch the wrestling, we don't care about the girls. But when you have a girl on there, half naked and doing simulated sex acts on a car every 45 seconds, there's only so much that you're going to be allowed to watch.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I'm surprised people don't talk enough about with the ruthless aggression era. Like we always call out the sexism of the attitude era, but the ruthless aggression era somehow either gets a pass or just gets ignored. And as far as sexism goes, ruthless aggression era may have been in some regard more egregious than what we got in the attitude era. Like even like staying on Leah, like this is the second year in a row where her relationship is basically on the line. Because like the SummerSlam before that, it was Matt Hardy versus Kane. Winner gets to marry Leah, which is a nuts stipulation.
Going to your point, they were just as blatantly sexist, and if not more, but they were saying, oh, we're not so bad because we're giving them a 2-minute match every 30 days. So they're doing this whole, but see, we're letting the women wrestle, but they're also in bra and panties and simulating sex acts in the ring in front of children, but we're letting them wrestle, but they're whipping out their tits in the ring, but we're letting them wrestle, it's okay. you know the sexism in WWE, speaking as a cisgendered male, and you speaking as a cisgendered male, of course, we don't want to speak for women wrestling fans of this era or women of any era because we're not women and that's not appropriate. But it to me, as a male, it just seems so much more insulting that they were like, but we're letting you wrestle sometimes, so you should be okay taking your clothes off. Personally, that seems like that's even worse than just not even being given the opportunity to wrestle in the early to mid 90s.
I agree with you there because like as much as it's cool to see women own up and really just anybody own up their sexuality and just own it, the way they portrayed the women was egregious because for one thing it was lopsided. This wouldn't be an issue if we had saw men owning their sexuality in the same way, but especially in the way it was portrayed, like again with Leah, like even beyond Leah, like the whole Divas division were very sexualized, and depending on how they were written, if they were a good guy or a bad guy, that was either a good thing or a bad thing. Like Leah was just as sexualized as any other woman on the card or on the show or in WWE overall at the time. But because she was a bad guy, you've got what's his name? Jerry Lawler basically calling her a slut on commentary. Even Jim Ross is getting his jabs in. Like he makes a crack about how Leah doesn't mind being in between two men. Like even JR is getting his cracks in. He's usually like the middle ground guy who just stays neutral. Like that highlighted to me even more just how much the sexism was just kind of rampant in '05.
Absolutely. But I do think it's important that we get back into the matches. But I did want to just make this one final comment on that whole segment with the washing of the car. There's a place for that kind of segment in wrestling in that era, and I understand that, and I understand again that we're coming at it with our we live in 2020 woke glasses bullshit, and I was probably super excited to watch that segment at God 2005. I would have been 10 years old. But the thing is, you see how talented a lot of these women that were signed to the WWE were during this era, because they're brought back for the 2018 Royal Rumble. They're brought back for the 2019 Royal Rumble, 2019 Evolution pay-per-view. And all these women are 10, 11, 12 years older and presumably a step or two slower than they would have been back in their prime of 2000 to 2005, 2006, and they're killing it. So it hurts to go back and look and say, but we could have had such incredible stuff right then. Like Lita and Kelly, or Lita and oh goodness, what is her name? Molly Holly would have had incredible matches if Molly Holly had been allowed to wrestle, if Kelly had been allowed to wrestle, or even trained to wrestle, and not just brought in and expected to be a hot girl that was, featured somewhat regularly.
I 100% agree with you. This is a topic I feel like I can drone on for like an hour, but like you said, gotta get back to the matches. And since you brought up Leah a lot, and since this is the next match on the card, let's talk about Matt Hardy versus Edge.
This was better than the first match. It definitely doesn't hold a candle to the second half of the card still, but it is good to see Edge and Matt Hardy younger and not yet broken down, like being able to move in the ring and kind of remind yourself, oh, this is why, people 5, 6, 7 years older than the two of us are so in love with these two guys, is because they were so good for so long. It does make me cringe quite often when you're watching this match and you're seeing people you're seeing like Edge take that spear through the ropes to the outside. That sucked. That hurt. Like I physically cringed. It was a bad time. But other than that, I mean, it was an okay match.
See, I'm kind of like in a weird state with this match because I view it in almost the same way as I view the first match. It is better, but it's very much a match that I don't think it's very good, but it does stay out with what it tries to do. Like it's underwhelming in regards to what these two can do, and they want to have much better matches after this, a much better street fight, much better steel cage match, ladder match. And this is like the first match in their feud that got a whole lot of press because it weaved together real life issues with storyline issues. This being their first match, and it basically ends in a what they call it, no contest referee stoppage. That's what it is.
Yeah, it was a referee stoppage.
Ends in referee stoppage in like 5 minutes. It's a very underwhelming start to the feud, and I don't know if that meant that they just knew they had a lot in the tank and they wanted to just stretch this out a little more. And if that's the case, they still should have had a more exciting way to make you want to see more of this match. Because, like, with all the hype surrounding it, I can only imagine. I can't remember what I thought the first time I saw it. I didn't watch it when it first aired. It was some years after the fact. But for this to be the first match in this hot feud, I'd feel like I'd be disappointed for it to end this fast, like this. And I imagine a whole lot of people are disappointed as well.
Yeah, it's another one where you look back with the rose-colored glasses of 2020 and say these guys both separately have had such incredible careers, both as single stars and as tag teams. So you want this match, this start to their feud, to live up to an expectation you have in your head. So like they're still very early on in their WWE careers, so they haven't quite hit that stride of like, no, we're incredible and we can hold our own. Like it's one of those situations where you wish it would have gone on longer, but you have to understand and think back to the booking decisions that were being made at that time and recognize that it is what they were allowed to do because it's what they were trusted to do.
I agree with you there. And one thing I forgot to mention is that the reason I kind of view this in the same regards as the first match, in that it set out what it tried to do. I felt like this match tried to duplicate an actual fight. Like they wanted you to believe that these two really hate each other, and in some regards maybe they did. And A lot of this match was very sloppy and ugly, but I don't say that as a criticism. I say that in the way that actual real life fights are really ugly and sloppy, and you got people falling over each other and like really ugly sleeper holds. That happens in real fights, and try and duplicate real fight, this kind of worked.
Yeah, it's definitely one where you see the sparks of brilliance. You see where it's going to go, but it's not quite there yet. They aren't quite comfortable enough or weren't given enough time to do everything that they both know that they could do in ring. And it's really interesting when you think that like Edge himself only has like 6 years left on his career after this match. So from being this guy that has a really disappointing outing at SummerSlam that ends in a no contest to one of the greatest of all time in just 6 years is really, really impressive.
100%. And from one feud that didn't click immediately to a feud that very much clicked. Next match is Eddie Guerrero versus Rey Mysterio in a Custody of Dominik ladder match. That sentence is nuts.
Oh, this is such a weird match because it's one that I watched in 2005 and I watched again when I got back into wrestling around like 2016. Had no memory of watching it in 2005. Didn't realize that that was on that card. No connection to it at all. And it's such a good match because it is still so incredible even looking back on it today. In the way that like you look back on the Edge Matt Hardy or even the Benoit match, and you have that kind of like pit in your stomach, like, oh, that could have been interesting, but Benoit's a bastard, or they only gave you guys 5 minutes. This still holds up, and I would argue will hold up to any ladder match that you want to put against it. You want to put it up against the ladder match for the North American title at Takeover New Orleans. It may not win because that ladder match was also incredible, but it will hold up. It will hold its own. You want to put it up against the first tables, ladders, and chairs. I think it holds up. You want to put it up against any of the Ring of Honor ladder war matches. I think it holds up. This match and these performers were so far ahead of their time and so willing and even eager to put their bodies on the line to say, you don't get to count us out just because we're not white 6'5" and chewing on steroids every minute of every day. Why Rey Mysterio at 17 in San Diego, who was traveling across the border every evening to go train in Lucha Libre at 17, 16, 15 years old, was going to be considered one of the great up-and-comers, and why the Guerrero family is the Guerrero family even today when only one of them is regularly wrestling anymore. It's all in this match because this is one of those matches that I talk about a lot where story is more important to me than being a spot monkey. There are definitely spot monkey moments here, like the electric chair into the power bomb on the side of the ladder, where Ray literally like throws his body off the ladder, catches himself lower on the ladder, pulls Eddie into the powerbomb and then drops him down, all in a fluid motion. So you don't know if he slipped and just caught himself or he meant to do it. That is a very spot monkey moment. But there's also that storytelling of, Dominik coming over the barricade and trying to shake Eddie off the ladder because he doesn't want to go home with Eddie, but he's not strong enough yet. And, the eventual Vicky Guerrero coming in and off the ladder because she doesn't want to take Dominik home, to, Ray having that baby face fighting from below moment of pulling himself up in the turnbuckle, climbing the ladder and retrieving the DNA test, I guess, or the custody paper, whatever was in the briefcase that meant that Dominik was his son now. All of this was such incredible storytelling that would be right at home on Days of Our Lives or right at home on, some other uh daytime television soap opera. My mom only watched Days of Our Lives. I don't know. General Hospital or whatever. Like, this is a story that would be well within the realm of believability on these shows, but because these guys are world-class athletes, we're willing part of our brain that goes, this doesn't make sense because we're watching something incredible. And I'm getting goosebumps now talking about it. I got goosebumps earlier today when I was rewatching it, same as I got goosebumps in 2005.
Yeah, like I think that really attests to the talent of both Rey Mysterio and Guerrero because on paper, this storyline shouldn't work. Like it's
At all.
super at all. It's super silly. But there's a reason why we're still talking about the storyline in 2020. Like we've seen plenty of silly storylines in WCW, WWE, but they don't have as much shelf life as this. And I think it's because Eddie Guerrero and Rey Mysterio have such great chemistry that they made it work not only in matches like this, but in promos where like a lot of those promos, just the overall storyline just still works in 2020. There's a reason why it's still incorporated in the current storylines between Buddy Murphy, Seth Rollins, and Rey Mysterio. There's a reason why that silly storyline does not work. And I'm not trying to knock their talent in any way. They're all phenomenal talents in their own right. But none of them are an Eddie Guerrero. Eddie Guerrero alone really made this storyline, really made this match. And the big thing is that both of these two guys really understood what they wanted to achieve with this match, the story, and just character wise. You see this match, and Rey Mysterio clearly understands that he's a character who's fighting for his son, someone who, regardless of custody, DNA, that is his son. He loves his son. And you understand perfectly that Eddie Guerrero is a guy who doesn't care about his kid, but wants custody of him just to spite Rey Mysterio. And that character dynamic leads to really great chemistry and just a match where you can't help but just hate Eddie Guerrero and just root for Rey Mysterio to the very end. And the first time I saw this match was in '07 when I first got into wrestling. Like, when I first got into wrestling, I really wanted to just recap and all of the history I missed. I wanted to understand current storylines that call back to like years prior stuff. So I ended up renting or having my brother rent for me like all these old wrestling DVDs. And one DVD I had rent was the ladder match, which was a whole compilation of just about all the important ladder matches you need to see to understand ladder matches. First ever ladder match from this old Southern territory, first ladder match in WWE history, first all the TLC matches that happened to that point. And on
Pretty
Last
sure
Disc,
that first ever ladder match happened down here in WCCW. Or not, no, not, yeah, World Class Championship Wrestling in Dallas, about 30 minutes from where I live currently.
was that the one with I think Jake Roberts versus like Junkyard? It was like a lawn scaffold ladder, black and white, something like that.
I think so. If not, that was probably NWA Deep South out of Louisiana. I will have to do some research, but for some reason, I feel like that might have been done down here.
Okay, yeah. I couldn't remember like what the exact organization was, but yeah, like it had all the important ladder matches. This match was on there, and for all the great matches that was on that DVD set, this always stood out to me as just one of the best. Not just because the storyline was just silly, because they showed the promo right before the match, and I'm just 10-year-old, 10-year-old me is just sitting there and are like, they're fighting over custody of a child.
Yeah.
But like the match without any context of a storyline, these two guys really just go out of their way to make this really good. Like I talked about how Matt Hardy versus Edge tried to duplicate a fight. Eddie Guerrero versus Rey Mysterio duplicated a fight within a wrestling match. Like you very much get the impression that these two characters hate each other and for very different reasons will do anything it takes to grab that briefcase of custody papers and go home with Dominik, which again sounds insane, but they make it work because they're really good.
Yeah, no, it's definitely one of those things where, like, as you're getting older and you're going back and you're researching Eddie Guerrero and you're researching Rey Mysterio, because you're not quite sure if the Rey Mysterio from 2005 is the same Rey Mysterio in 2017, because, they all wear masks and they might have been passed off. And you realize that these guys not only were best friends, but were like godfathers to each other's children and were training partners and would crisscross like the Southern United States, work together in WCW, were like a team in WCW and in no way hated each other. That really draws you into like the wild world of professional wrestling and how strange it is and how like, oh, you can act and do physical like feats and be like in a strongman contest and in a Greco-Roman wrestling contest and be an actor. That's super odd. That's really cool. And it draws you in even more for me, where a lot of people, that kind of like realization that it's not necessarily real kind of turns them off. That was one of those things that made me go, oh, this is dope. I'm in.
I couldn't agree more. And just side note, it's wild to think that Dominic was like 10, 11 years old himself, and this year at SummerSlam, 15 years later, has first match against Seth Rollins. That's insane.
Yeah. No, it's wild that that's only been 15 years and he's now an active superstar, and that his dad is still an active superstar. You know, he's more of a part-timer at this point, but especially with the pandemic and them not traveling, like he is very much an active member of the roster, which is just insane.
And that brings us into our next match, Eugene versus Kurt Angle. We want to talk about stuff that it's kind of problematic with 2020 eyes, but yeah.
Yeah, that match is, you know, it was certainly a match. It
Mm,
was certainly a thing that occurred. I
yes.
don't know that we would call it good or even terribly intriguing in any kind of way, but it was definitely a thing that was put on pay-per-view. That's
Honestly,
that's that's the positive thing I can bring out of this, is it took up time on a pay-per-view.
honestly, the problematicness behind Yuji's character aside, I'm willing to say this is a good match. Like they had genuinely good chemistry. Like take his character out of it. The guy behind the character, Nick Dinsmore, is just a very good wrestler in his own right, and you can watch his OVW stuff to see him like play like a serious wrestler without the character shtick. And like I understand why he personally pitched the character of Eugene just so he can get called up because they had him in OVW for like 8, 9 years. No
Hmm.
characters were clicking. He just came up with this character, which doesn't look great with 2020 eyes, but at the very least, you one thing you can never take away is that Nick Dinsmore is just a really good wrestler, and he was really good with Kurt Angle because he's like Kurt Angle, he's got like a genuine All-American wrestling background. They kind of played off that a little bit, but also like the story behind it was just really simple, and I think they both played it up well. Like Eugene was just Eugene. He liked gold, so he took Kurt Angle's shiny gold medal. Kurt Angle, meanwhile, like a year removed from his last World Heavyweight Championship reign or WWE Championship reign, is incensed not only because Eugene stole his gold medals, he's angry that he's even in the ring with someone like Eugene. The fact someone like Eugene can stare across from a former WWE champion and get a marquee match like this, and he's taking all of that anger out on Eugene, and somehow Eugene is pulling out whatever type of strength he has to get a couple near falls on Kurt Angle, but it works, I think. I was entertained, personally.
Uh, Works is a stretch, I think. I think it took place. I don't know that I would say it worked, because it is the whole reason that that match is expected to work for fans when you go back and watch it is because you're expected to believe that Eugene has R-word strength and can just, he gets frustrated and he loses sight of, what he needs to do, and he just goes on a rampage and violent outbursts and da da da, all these like hurtful stereotypes that you like to think weren't as prevalent, when we were kids, as they very clearly are. Obviously all credit to the guy behind Eugene. He is a very talented wrestler. Otherwise, that match would have looked like even more dog shit than it did. And I get where he was coming from. He was in OVW for a very long time, and the world was in a much different place in 2005 than it is today. It's one of those matches, the same as the Benoit match to kick it off, where for a vastly different reason, you look at it and you just get uncomfortable.
Yeah, I agree with you there. Like as far as like the character stuff, like it's the most uncomfortable stuff about the match. But I guess the reason I like it is that it kind of works despite itself. Like
Hmm.
even outside of the character stuff just not looking good in 2020, it probably didn't even look good in '05 just because like at this point, I guess Eugene was very much positioned as a babyface, but either because people really loved Kurt Angle or they had gotten either annoyed or uncomfortable by the Eugene character. Eugene was getting booed the whole match. Kurt Angle was getting cheered the whole match. Dynamic wise, it wasn't working. Looking at his character in 2020 eyes, it's not working, but because they're just talented wrestlers, I just liked it for whatever reason. And I think
Yeah,
it
I
works
mean
despite it.
it's definitely one of those matches that I think would have aged a lot better if two talented wrestlers had just been allowed to be two talented wrestlers, kind of in the same way that like the uh you know Bret Michaels, goodness, Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels era of matches work. One, because it's believable that they hate each other, but also two, because those are legitimately two of the greatest to ever lace up a pair of wrestling boots, just getting in a ring and figuring out who's better on any given day. And I think had Eugene been allowed to wrestle as himself, that would have been a similar case there. But it is one of those situations where rose-colored glasses, looking back on it, you kind of have to just take it for what it is and not try to put your own ethics and morals on the event and the match itself.
I completely agree, and it just kind of harkens me back to what I think is like a tragedy of Nick Dinsmore's career or WWE career. Tragedy is a strong word, but again, like when you look at his OVW stuff and even sprinkled in certain WWE matches, he's a very talented wrestler, but he wasn't allowed to show the full extent of his talent because he was pigeonholed by this gimmick that was kind of a problem in 2005 and is definitely a problem in 2020. And again, I get why he pitched that gimmick. He really wanted to get called up, but there's no coming back from a character like that. People weren't taking him seriously, and because of that, it left his WWE career had a short shelf life. I think he got released like he debuted the character in like '04, and I think he got released in like '07, something like that. And like you obviously can't evolve out of that character. You just kind of gotta stick with it your whole career.
Hmm.
But I think that if he was allowed to just be the serious wrestler that he proved to be in OVW, we'd be singing a different tune about Dinsmore, and he'd have a much longer successful career, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. He's one of those guys that falls victim to his character and not to his own drive. Similar to like a No Way Jose, who was released earlier this year and is by all accounts a very, very talented wrestler and a very well liked guy. His character just didn't work, so they got rid of him. This Eugene character is uh, very similar in that respect, where he, from everything I've ever seen or read, was a well liked guy. He had no issues with anyone in the locker room. It's just it was 2005, and that kind of thinking about people with mental disabilities was going out with the bathwater, you know. And he pitched a character at the wrong time in the wrong era.
100%. And if only he pitched a better character, but that's neither
Exactly.
here nor there. Moving on to the next match, Undertaker versus Randy Orton. What'd you think of this one?
This I really liked. This was Undertaker. He was already starting to slow down, but he wasn't quite as slow as he was going to become. Like you could see that he was hurting and was probably injured through this match. But you've got young Randy Orton, like, still happy to be there, still excited to be able to work in the ring, and willing to sell his ass off for the Undertaker. And then the Undertaker, of course, coming in with all, at this point, the Undertaker gimmick itself is very well fleshed out and understood now that he's been doing it for 97 to 05, so almost 10 years, like 8 years at this point. So like he knows the beats and the moments that he has to hit to get the crowd over and on his side and hot immediately, and he hits them with ease and with precision that really cement to me that he is going to go down as one of the best workers of all time, not because of his work rate and the things he did in his matches, but the psychology he was able to bring into everything he did. I genuinely enjoyed this match.
See, I was the opposite. I kind of didn't really like this one, and it kind of makes me wish I kind of watched this back to back with the WrestleMania one, which I actually have always been a fan of, and that one was actually much shorter. This one was much longer. I think the Mania match might have been like 12, 13 minutes. The SummerSlam match was a little over 20 minutes. And with all that time, it felt like they slowed the match down too much, too often, specifically Undertaker. Like, I feel like if you're going to have a wrestler slow the match down, it needs to be a heel slowing it down because I want to see the babyface come out on top and get his stuff back in. I want to see the babyface show more exciting moves, and the heel is going to piss me off by slowing the match down, doing a leg lock or a sleeper hold. That usually works. It kind of worked in the, again, going back to the Bound for Glory episode, worked with Christian versus Samoa Joe. But with this, you kind of had reverse, like you had the babyface and Undertaker slowing things down a lot, which again makes sense because he's much older and more methodical, I suppose. And Orton, every time he got his heat back, he would do more exciting moves like power slams and like the backbreaker and stuff like that. He had a very exciting moveset that he showcased, and I'm supposed to be rooting against him, but I wanted to root for him because he was making the match exciting every time he got back into the match, and it it was just too slow for me, is what I'm trying to say.
And that's completely fair. I think that comes at the cost of both these guys' styles, where like the Undertaker, if you were still dealing like with Mean Mark Callis WCW, where he's doing like tightrope walks and top turnbuckle moves and things like that, I think the match would have been a lot faster. But his whole character is he is always coming after you. He will eventually get his hands on you, and when he does, you're done. He's the epitome of a horror villain. He is slow moving, but he's always right there. You turn around and he's right behind you. You can sprint for 20 minutes and get around a corner, but when you turn, he's right there. He's always moving forward. He's never deterred. And this is like right around the time that you've got Randy Orton starting to work on his Viper character and start to become that slow, methodical, playing with his prey kind of guy. So it's two slow workers working slowly together, which can be a little, what's the word I'm looking for? Not obtrusive, but a little
Monotonous.
distracting, I guess.
Distracting works.
Where it's you find yourself waiting for that next spot, so you find yourself drifting off of like, oh yeah, I've got to do this tonight, I got to go here, I got to whatever, and then it snaps you back in when Orton is able to pull off like a power slam or something like that. So I think if we were still dealing with like early Randy Orton, when he is kind of full of piss and vinegar and like moving a million miles an hour, it would have been a much different and much more entertaining match for you.
I agree with you there. Though even though I didn't like it, I do like appreciate this overall feud because I feel like this was like his big main event breakout situation. Like a lot of people call back to the Cactus Jack match as his breakout moment, and in many ways it was, but the way he worked with Undertaker for this entire year with the promos and the matches and the character work, that kind of cemented just how much he belonged in the main event. Like, oh, this guy could go with the sans this match, but if you look at their Mania match and the Hell in a Cell, this guy can go with a vet like The Undertaker. He needs to be in the main event forever. And since then, he's kind of has been in the main event forever, even the current WWE champion. So I appreciate the feud in that regard. What do you think of the ending of this match?
Remind me on the ending. It's been a couple of days since I watched the card. I'm sorry.
So Undertaker was about to go for his tombstone. A a fan who I like to think of as a time traveler with a MAGA hat stormed the ring
Oh,
and
Lord.
was about to attack the Undertaker. He gets extorted out. Undertaker turns around to an RKO. 1, 2, 3. Orton leaves. He goes back to the fan and he pulls off the prosthetics of the fan's face to reveal that this is not a MAGA time traveler. This is Randy Orton's dad, Bob Orton, in disguise. Why he needed disguise, I don't know, but what did
This
you
I do
think of it?
remember. This I do remember. They never really gave us a payoff for Bob Orton in disguise, did we? Did they? Other than it just being Bob Orton. But I guess you
Think
weren't really watching the TV product at this point.
I'm aware of some of the promos. It calls back to the Mania build-up where Bob Orton, like he begs Undertaker, please don't basically legend kill my son at WrestleMania. He's got his whole career ahead of him. But in him begging Undertaker to spare Orton, it turns out that Bob Orton was just using it as a ruse so Orton can attack Undertaker from behind. Fast forward to SummerSlam, he's reintroduced to the storyline. Orton, I think he also kept like being his manager from then until that Hell in a Cell him and Undertaker had in December, I think. And I think him and Undertaker even had a match where Taker just bloodied Bob Orton completely and just ran him off television.
Well, with that context, I think it's very cool. In the moment, as it was going, it caught me by surprise. I was like, okay, uh, okay. And then I just kind of clicked on to the next match. I mean, I wish I had more of a reaction so we could talk about it, but it was more just like, oh, that's his dad. Why does he and Undertaker have heat? Oh, they're not going to tell me? Okay, cool. And then, you just kind of keep moving.
Even with the context, I kind of had that same reaction. Though, like I'm fine with Orton interfering. I kind of wish they executed a little better. But even if they executed it better, like it's the more I'm thinking about why I wasn't a huge fan of this ending, it's because I'm looking down the card and most of these matches kind of ended with fishy finishes. Like Matt Hardy
Hmm.
versus Edge ended in referee stoppage. Eddie Guerrero versus Rey ended with Vicky interfering, and even John Cena versus Jericho to some extent had some shenanigans in it. So
Hmm.
you see basically more than half the cards got shenanigans. Like you're gonna, well, at least me personally, am going to get annoyed when another match ends in shenanigans.
Yeah, no, it's definitely when you're watching them all right back to back, you're kind of sitting there, you're like, oh, so creative just didn't know how to finish this. Cool. And then you kind of keep moving, but it's definitely one where you're kind of glad that this match isn't the one that's regarded so highly or even remembered at all from that card, because you've also obviously got Eddie Guerrero, Rey Mysterio's ladder match, and then the main event are the ones that are remembered for vastly different reasons, but they are remembered. So it's kind of, I'm happy that both of these guys were able to kind of just sweep this one under the rug and then come back at Hell in a Cell and put together a much more impressive outing.
Agreed. And that leads us to our WWE Championship match of the night. John Cena in his first pay-per-view match as a Raw superstar, defending against Chris Jericho. What do you think?
This is another one that was good, but wasn't where it could have been. You've got Cena in the early days of his first reign with the WWE Championship. He's still trying to figure out what he's doing. I don't even think was he the Doctor of Thugonomics here, or was he still Fruity Pebbles, peace and love, changing my gear for every city I'm in, Cena?
He was still Dr. Thugonomics, but this was the point where he was slowly phasing that out of his character and
Got it.
getting
Okay.
closer to Fruity Pebble Cena.
Got it. Okay, so you're moving from like Cena rapping "I hate everything," kind of sort of heel, but not really, to the Cena that we all would love to hate for the next 12 years. That is, peace, love, respect, eat your vitamins, and take your medicine and da-da-da-da-da. Hogan without a racism issue. You laugh, but I'm not wrong.
You're
And then
not.
you've got Jericho, who, at least in my mind in 2005, was winding down his pro wrestling career. He'd been active since like 1992 over in New Japan, and had really incredible matches over there, had incredible matches in WCW, and hadn't really lived up to that hype in WWE to this point, in my mind. Obviously, I was wrong. I eat crow here. That's fine. He's been doing incredible stuff for almost over 30 years, because he had his 30-year anniversary this year. So it's one of those where any other time in either of these guys' careers, going forward for Cena, going backwards or forward for Jericho, I think they would have been able to come at it with such a different energy and so much more vigor that it would have been a much more impressive match, at least in my mind.
I 100% agree with you there because I got the same type of like iffiness from this match. Like I recognize that it's a solid match, but I wasn't super into it. I recognize that what they were doing in the match was decent, maybe even solid, but it just wasn't connecting with me. And like you said, it might have to do with just the fact that Jericho was on his way out. In fact, this was his, if I'm not mistaken, this was his last pay-per-view before he left. And then a couple Raws after this, maybe the next night after this, he had his loser leaves town match against John Cena, which is oddly poetic because he John Cena's career started with John Cena, Chris Jericho putting him over at Cena's first pay-per-view, and now it's ending with Jericho laying down for Cena again. So it's oddly poetic in that regard, but because Jericho was on his way out and Cena was still figuring things out as his newly established face of not only the company but especially Monday Night Raw, having just been drafted there, just something wasn't really there wasn't enough investment, I think, on either of their behalf. Well, not investment, they were figuring things out, for lack of a better term, I suppose.
Yeah, I think it's very clear watching back that match that Jericho's mind is anywhere but in a WWE ring. He left WWE in 2005 for New Japan, or did he go to Impact, or where did he end up going?
He stopped wrestling after this for like 3 years and just started doing Fozzy stuff.
Oh, okay. So this is his like I'm a rock star, worship me kind of era. That makes a lot of sense. So yeah, you can tell that his mind isn't in the ring. He is still very talented and he's very safe because of course he is. You know, he's not going to ruin his ability to come back because he doesn't want to be there. But he's not as invested as he is early on in his WCW and WWE runs. He's not as hungry for professional wrestling as he was. And I do think those 3 years off did him good because he comes back and he's hungry and he's ready to like kill it and he gets right after it. It's just at this point where he's at, he wasn't there, and it was one that we probably could have done without.
100% agreed. And like for, if nothing else, I do kind of like the ending. Like I'm not super big on Chris Jericho slightly getting distracted by arguing with the ref, but I like the whole getting into like a tilt-a-whirl FU type of deal. Like that was a cool transition. And I even like the stuff like halfway through a match where Cena went for the five knuckle shuffle and he runs right into Walls of Jericho. Like they were like little spurts of goodness, but
Hmm.
because neither of those guys were there yet for different reasons, Cena because he's figuring things out as a new top babyface, Jericho because he's on his way out, it just wasn't clicking, unfortunately. And after this, we get the World Heavyweight Championship no holds barred match between champion Batista and challenger John Bradshaw Layfield. What'd you think of this one?
I didn't hate this one. I'm a big Batista guy. JBL, his politics aside, was talented, I guess. When he was in the WWE, like he was never as good as he thought he was, but he was very good. He was good on the mic, and he was a strong guy. This is one that I think probably should have gone on last. Like this should have been the main event. I get why the main event was the main event because those two are legends, but I feel like we would have left that pay-per-view on a much higher note had this been the end than we would have watching Hulk Hogan and Shawn Michaels stumble around and try to put together a decent match.
See, this was another one that I didn't really like, but that's also because I'm not the biggest fan of JBL matches. Like, I realized this like a 3, 4 years ago. Whenever Jinder Mahal was WWE champion, I noticed Mahal got a lot of comparisons to JBL's reign. So when I had WWE Network, I just to compare and contrast, I watched every pay-per-view Raw and SmackDown that JBL was the champion. And I realized that while JBL was a great heat magnet, he made you want to genuinely hate him. He just wasn't that entertaining in the ring. And maybe that's because he's working that heel style, but it's hard for me to really call him a good wrestler. Like I hate knocking guys like that because I know I'm not a good wrestler. Never have, never will be. But he's a stiff worker, and there's a place for stiff
Hmm.
workers, and his stiffness is what gives him one of the best clotheslines in the business. But if you take away that clothesline, there's nothing to write home about with his matches or his moveset. This is one of those matches, and me not even being a big fan of like brawling street fights, the first half of the match is just these two just punching each other, walking 10 steps backwards into the crowd until they make their way back to the ring. And even back to the ring, you isn't much to talk about besides like a steel step Batista bomb. And before you even get that, I'm looking at my watch thinking just this needs to be over soon. Like, and I can't even imagine myself really being into this if I was actually watching in '05, because you gotta understand that this JBL is 2, maybe 3 months removed from having a year-long WWE Championship reign and then trying to chase that title against Cena for like another 2 months. So he's been a staple of that main event scene. And if I'm not digging his matches, I'm probably dirt tired by the time we get to SummerSlam. And I'm just like, can JBO just go away already? And for this 12, 13 minute match, I was just waiting for JBL to go away.
Yeah, no, JBL and my interest in JBL, definitely again as I got back into wrestling and went back and like started looking into everybody on this card, comes more from his stuff outside the ring with the APA and just being, Mr. JBL, John Bradshaw Layfield rolling up to the ring in the limo with the steer horns on the front and like the big 10-gallon cowboy hat and just being that larger than life, like I've always got to dip in, like I'm a good old Southern boy and I will beat the shit out of you to prove it kind of guy. That was more where my interest in him came from. He is not a great worker, which is being charitable, but I do think that with when he worked with guys that were willing to sell for him and were willing to sell how brutal he was in the ring, he came off really impressively. It's one of those things where if Batista had not sold one of those clotheslines or one of those strikes to the face or, just kind of no sold one thing, the whole match would have crumbled. But the fact that Batista, even being at the height of, being Batista, was willing to take those blows and like lay down and like show that they were really rocking him, really laid credence to the fact that like, no, this guy will mess you up.
I can see that. And credit is due. Like JBL was still like a great character. I think that gave him longevity without necessarily being a great worker in the ring. Like
Hmm.
whether he was the sluggish brawler where that stiff fighting style kind of worked for him in the ring, or if he was that pompous billionaire. He had great presentation to him. He knew how to get character over. He could cut a promo. I don't think he's WWE champion for nearly as long if he wasn't a great character or a great promo. And I will give credit where credit is due there, but when, for me at least, if you're gonna sell me on the match, you also have to deliver. And unfortunately, this match didn't deliver.
Yeah, no, I completely see where you're coming from, and it is one where I think it would have delivered a lot more if had it gone on last and been able to kind of ride the lack of momentum that the main event is going to bring us into. But unfortunately, the way it ended going into this main event kind of just tanked that whole show.
I can see that as well. This might have worked better as the main event, but it wasn't the main event. What was the main event was Icon versus Icon, first match ever. The Immortal One versus the Heartbreak Kid, Shawn Michaels versus Hulk Hogan. What did you think of this one?
The Heartbreak Kid who's already losing his hair, and the Immortal One who looks like he's been dead and buried twice. This was hot garbage. This was not good. I didn't think this was good in 2005. I didn't think this was good a couple of years ago when I went back and rewatched the show. I'm going to sit back up so I'm properly in frame. And I didn't think it was good when I watched it today. This, if it had been anybody but Hulk Hogan and HBK, would be widely considered one of the worst matches ever put on by WWE, in my opinion. Like, this was bad. This was made worse by the fact that these two guys are these two guys, but this was bad. Like, the fact that these two guys, disregard the fact that HBK returns again for, Saudi Arabia and makes himself look like a complete ass. This was Hulk Hogan's Saudi Arabia moment where he's like, I'm going to go out on top. I'm going to be the greatest that ever was, that ever will be. Da-da-da-da-da. Meh, meh, meh. Beating my chest, like, eat your vitamins, Hulkamania bullshit. And then he shits the bed. And he goes out with his tail between his legs, and he's not seen again for another couple of years, because this is around the time that he goes over and tries to reinvent himself with TNA. It was
Actually,
so bad, man. Oh,
uh,
am I wrong?
yeah, I hate to cut you off, but he actually came back a whole year after this SummerSlam '06 against Orton.
I am completely wrong. That is in my dead area, and I shudder to think that I'm gonna have to watch that match at some point. But this was so bad, man. And I you might think it was great, but it was awful. It was so awful.
I'm so glad we're on the same page here. This was horrible. Like,
Oh man.
this was another match that I saw in '06, I mean '07 to pick me up back to pace for all the wrestling I missed. I don't remember disliking it this much, but man, this match was just horrible. Like, I shudder to think like how bad this would be if they were both baby phases. Because at the very least, you could say, okay, Shawn Michaels working a heel thing, something he hadn't done in like 10 years, at least adds a different facet to the match that you don't
Does
see. Uh,
does it
he
though?
didn't work this style a lot when he came back that '02 '11 run. This
Mm-hmm.
was this was like the only like 5 6 month stretch where he worked heel. So I will give credit for at least him being different. I will criticize him for him not being a very good heel in this match. Well, at least having a very good sharpshooter, because that sharpshooter was just the ugliest. And another thing about the sharpshooter spot, so like I
The
feel
fact that
like
he tried to do a sharpshooter spot is hilarious.
I'm not even sure he tried. That's the worst part, because like a
Oh
couple months
man.
before that, like him trying to produce heat for the SummerSlam match, they had like a Raw in Canada episode. This was Shawn Michaels' first time in Canada since the Montreal Screwjob, and he keeps bigging up the whole Bret Hart thing. He's gagging on the Montreal crowd. It was actually a great promo in itself, thinking back on it.
It's
But
when he opens the show with Montreal, who's your daddy, right?
yes,
Yeah.
yeah, it was a great promo. But I feel like stuff like these callbacks to the Screwjob, him doing the sharpshooter badly, I might add, that only works if you're working a match in Montreal. The Washington D.C. crowd didn't care he was doing the sharpshooter. They just saw he was doing the ugliest sharpshooter I've ever seen. And you probably say that for a lot of this match, that both guys were doing the ugliest things you've ever seen in a ring. And I'm surprised that this match doesn't get enough hate for being one of the worst matches in WWE history. The only thing I can think is that maybe like Shawn Michaels flopping around at least makes it a fun botchamania moment.
Hmm.
But no selling or overselling, this match was just bad, and it made me even more glad that this show was over. I really did not like this show. Like, matches were either underwhelming or just really bad. The only good match I think that you could really speak of end up being the amazing ladder match between Ray and Eddie, and everything surround, and I guess maybe to some extent Eugene versus Kringle. But again, I feel like I only like that just because it had no business being as good as it was. It may not have
Hmm.
even been that good, but again, it was good despite itself. But outside of those two or really 1.5 matches, it's this was not a good card for me.
No, absolutely not. You're completely right. This was a bad show. It was also just the first show I saw, which is why we're reviewing it. Yeah, the Eddie and Rey match is remembered as fondly as it is because it was surrounded by crap. Like at the end of the day, that's why it's remembered as fondly as it is, because if it was on a card with 6 other 5-star matches, it would be still a well-respected and well-loved match, but it wouldn't be as beloved as it was. This was not a great card. This was at a weird point in the WWE where like you had some new guys starting to gain some speed and starting to put together interesting characters that would carry the WWE into the 2010s and beyond, but a lot of them weren't there yet. And then you had some old guard starting to slowly fade that weren't quite ready to fade. And so you had a lot of clashing there. And this unfortunately suffered for that.
I'm curious, like, I guess you kind of like answered my question like already, but like, curious, like, how is it overall hold up as far as like this being the first pay-per-view you ever watched? Like, would 10-year-old Sam from '05 still like this show knowing what he knows now?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. No, not at all. But I think that's still it doesn't so much speak negatively on the wrestling as much as it just speaks to how interest and tastes change. Because like I don't watch the shows I watched in 2005 every day. I don't watch the wrestling I watched in 2005 every day. Like my interest in my like belief on what makes a good match change every day, week, hour, minute, depending on what I'm watching. So I it holds a special place in my heart because it led me to a career and it led me to a podcast and to a lot of really good friends all through professional wrestling. But I think that's an important part of it, is being able to look back and say that was dog shit, but I still appreciate it for what it brought me without like making excuses for the fact that the match was not good.
Yeah, that's SummerSlam '05 in the books and a very cynical episode of Lapsed Graps in the books. But yeah, it is what it is.
Yeah, it's it's over, so that's good. I don't know, man. I don't know how to end this on a positive note. They're all legends.
Allegedly.
Allegedly legends.
Allegedly legends. That should be the title of this episode, but I'll figure that out in post. What you want to plug before we get out of here?
You can follow me on Twitter at Gladen, Sam, GladenCommASam. You can follow my coverage of all things pro wrestling at dailyddt.com. You can follow rather my coverage of mixed martial arts and a little bit of pro wrestling over at fansided.com. And then starting, I believe, next week, you'll be able to see me cover pro wrestling as well through sportskita.com. So just hit up my Twitter. All my links are there. You can find my words just about everywhere they're posted.
Hey, that's a good place to end it on right now. Congratulations, man. That's
Thank you,
what's
man. I
up.
appreciate that.
That's so dope. I have a much more underwhelming way to end this on my part. I'm just gonna say, people follow me at Wham Bam is Jam. My tweets aren't any good. My Instagram's not very good, but hey, it's Wham Bam is Jam. It's out there if you want to follow. And Mental Health Check-In podcast. Oh yeah, you can go to upliftunited.com after you listen to this, and Uplift United being this company I founded, this digital media company that incorporates a podcast network, Lapsed Graps included, Mental Health Check-In podcast included. Also shows like Broke Talk and the new Not That MJ podcast, which by the time you listen to this, episode 2 might just be dropping. And there's also articles on the website. I hope that this company, this website becomes a big thing in the future. And of course, I can't I tell him about this all the time when we're off the air, but I could not have done this without Sam as both a content
Oh, you gotta
creator
stop, my guy. You
and
gotta
a
stop.
producer. And it's gotta be said, man. And you've
Man,
been podcast producing, content creating, and you're a big part of why this is a thing. And it's a thing. So go upliftunited.com, pitch us some articles, listen to the podcast. Yeah.
Man, before we go, and we actually are going to go here in a second, I appreciate the shout out, but I got no doubt that you would have found a way to do this on your own, with or without me. I'm just glad I'm able to come along for the ride.
We may never know. It's like licking a Tootsie Roll. We may never know if there's a
Tootsie
sentence
Roll
to
Pop.
it. Tootsie Roll Pop, that's
If
the
you
one.
unwrap a Tootsie Roll and just lick it, you're a psychopath, and I will stand by that fact.
Man. Tootsie Roll Pop slander is probably a good place to end this podcast. So until next time, we out.
We out.